All right, moving right along here. Next, we're going to look at Jorge Luis Borges and his story, The Garden of Forking Paths. So, I'm excited for what feels like the first time in forever to just dive right into the author and the story without covering too much background and context, as important as that context is. And this is a truly enjoyable story. This is one of my favorite stories. If you've taken my short fiction class I teach, where we also read this story, I mentioned that as one of my top five stories we read in that class, and it's true for this class as well. The concept it deals with, parallel realities, is just such a fascinating concept. And I love this picture I found here that illustrates it with a labyrinth, all the different possible twists and turns you can take. And of course, you see Borges in his chair with his cat flying through the universe in this picture. Really encapsulates the story and Borges, who he was as this interesting figure. So let's dive in. Take a first a little on Borges himself. He was born in Buenos Aires, Argentina in 1899, and his library and his garden in the home where he grew up really shaped his imagination. And as you can see, the two stories the editors have chosen for the book are named after those two things, right? The Garden of Forking Paths and the Library of Babel. And so you have someone whose parents were not, they were literary, but not able to be literary in a professional way. They weren't paid to write, they had other jobs. But growing up, around books and out in the garden, how that shaped him as a youth. So as I said, both his parents were literary, um, but not for their profession. But his father had a novel he worked on his whole life, and was finally able to publish it fairly late in his life. And his mother translated famous authors. You can look the intro in the textbook to see which ones they were, but really well known authors such as I think Faulkner and maybe Joseph Conrad as well. Um, the family traveled to Geneva in 1914, and so Borges was 15 then and got caught and had to stay there. And he ended up staying there for, I think it was something like 8 years, quite a while, because World War I broke out while they were there. And so this is just another example, like many of the authors we're looking at. I mean, when you teach these modern authors, I mean, basically all of them bore witness, firsthand witness to some of the atrocities of the 20th century that we discussed in the last lecture. I mean, I'm going through each author in my mind now. Every single one of them witnessed the war in some way or another, whether they were on the front lines or up close to it in another manner. And so you have that context here for Borges. And if you see something like World War I firsthand, it shapes you and it shapes your writing. And that's why we have some of these stories that we do. After he returned to Buenos Aires, he got his first job as a municipal librarian at the time of his father's death in 1938. So he was not quite almost 40 years old. And this job was very important to him. His identity as a librarian was just very important to him, and it shaped um, the rest of his life. Some more context, kind of the world around him. In the early 20th century, Argentina was the wealthiest or one of the wealthiest Latin American countries. But it did eventually suffer from a Great Depression a little bit later in the 20th century. And Borges lived to be 87 years old. So he lived almost the entire 20th century. So he, again, saw these changes firsthand. A little bit of the context here. Once the Great Depression happened, Juan Perón, it was a military dictator, seized power. And, the Depression gave him the opportunity to do that. And Borges was opposed to this kind of military dictatorship and not afraid to be outspoken about it. And so Perón, once he took power, he removed Borges from his library job. Again, this identity was very important to him. So he'd been in that position for 8 years when he was forced out of it by the military dictator. And this next point is really interesting. The work that the government said you no longer can work in the library, this is what job you can have, was as a chicken inspector. I don't even know what that means. Um, I don't know why chickens need to be inspected and whose chickens this person is inspecting or how any of that works. So it was clearly a grave insult, but he was able to get a position. He was offered a position teaching literature at the University of Buenos Aires. So he was able to do that instead until later on he eventually got the library job back. We'll see in a minute. But we should take a second and talk about his eyesight. His father had terrible eyesight and had to have operations, surgery on his eyes, and eventually went blind. And the same was true for Borges. It must have been genetic. Despite 8 surgeries, 8 operations, Borges became mostly blind by middle age. And, even though he still wrote a lot in the late years of his life, he had to dictate his work. The good news was about 9 years later, after the fall, or after the loss of his library job, Perón's regime fell, and Borges not only got the job back, but got an even better one. He became the director of the National Library. So books and the history of books, as you can see from the story, mattered to him so much. This was an important position. And so it was really wonderful, that he got to have it. He got to be the director of the National Library. I didn't have quite enough room for the final bullet points here, but just a little bit more context. Later on, after this, later in his life, Perón tried to come back to power, and Borges opposed him again. And Perón seized power temporarily for not very long and was ousted by a different military group. And Borges was so opposed to Perón and his policies and his dictatorial style that he supported this revolutionary group that ousted Perón the second time Perón fell. The problem was that military group wasn't much better. And once they were in power, they did some, we'll say, unsavory things. And so Borges had supported them, not because he really believed in what they were doing, but because they were opposed to Perón. The idea being kind of the enemy of my enemy is my enemy. But unfortunately, it reflected negatively on Borges that he had supported this kind of military revolutionary type of group. A militant revolutionary type of group, I meant. And so a lot of readers think that's why he never won the Nobel Prize. He did so much. So many of the authors were studying or Nobel laureates. He should have been kind of a shoo-in, but he didn't. And so I think most critics speculate it's because he supported this group. I think it was late enough in his life as he was getting older and blind, he wanted his opponent gone and didn't think about really the problems with the enemy of his enemy. So why is all of this important? I mean, I don't want to just give you the biography of the author. I want to explain why it's important. Well, throughout his life, Borges saw the atrocities of World War I up fairly close. He also saw the issues of when a military dictator comes to power and how that can affect one's country. And he saw economic issues in his country. And so, witness to all of these types of things that were part of modernity, produced the types of stories we're going to look at. So let's take a look at the story itself. The Garden of Forking Paths. This is such an interesting story because it's really like a science fiction story almost. And Borges is famous for being an author who really straddled the worlds of literary and genre fiction. So literary fiction is, what we're reading, things that over the years scholars have decided have the great themes and great values that people all throughout the world value. And so these are the canonical pieces of literature. And genre fiction is typically seen as things like detective stories or science fiction stories that they fit a certain genre and they cater to the masses, so they're not as highly canonical. But Like I said, Borges straddles those two worlds. So he gives us a science fiction type of world here. And any fan of Star Trek or Battlestar Galactica would probably really enjoy this story. But at the same time, it really transcends that genre world and gives us a literary type of story with a great message and a great theme. Now, I'm a huge fan of genre fiction. I love science fiction. I love detective fiction. So I am not a snob about genre fiction the way other scholars might be. No disrespect to any of my colleagues. But it's important to know these distinctions, and it's important to know we're reading, the Norton Anthology of World Literature. I've chosen it because it's a great resource for piecing together great translations with great introductions of all these wonderful pieces of lit. But it certainly should not be considered a representative of the totality of the wonderful literature that's out there in the world. And I think genre fiction, plenty of it has a great message. But Borges, even though he wrote science fiction type stories, he still is considered by many scholars, not just those like me who like genre fiction, but by many scholars as someone who wrote great pieces of literature and should have won the Nobel Prize. And so the straddling of those two worlds, the literary and the genre fiction, how does he do it and why is that important? Well, you have a new reality. By a new reality, I mean the reality he creates in the story. Every author creates a new reality. They create a world. For instance, in Diary of a Madman, we have this community he lives in where we meet his older brother, his neighbors, some of the other people who live there, and we get a few characteristics of that community. So it may not be an in-depth portrait of world building, but we still have a fictional world. So when Borges creates a fictional world, he creates usually a fantastical fictional world, a much more complex one than we see in, say, like Diary of a Madman or something that's a little more realist leaning. And so he creates a science fiction fantastical type of a world. And that story, that science fiction type of story, even though it's a world that may seem a little more removed from our world than the worlds of the realist text we've read, it can teach us a great deal about the real world. So there's two questions you should ask whenever you're reading a story by Borges. And that is, one, what is this world like? What is the kind of abstract, more philosophical idea Borges is teaching us through this fantastical world? And then two, if we take that idea and we apply it to our world, what do we learn? Because Borges, as much as he's giving us a fantastical place, he's very much at the same time also just as much teaching us about the real world. So we can really ask, what do we learn from the special place Borges has created? And that's a very modernist thing. Remember, the modernist idea was, if you take what what Dostoevsky did with Notes from Underground or similar texts and had like a realism of extremes, remember that term? Where he was saying this may be more extreme than the author who's depicting more mundane kinds of things, but it's just as real. The modernists really took that idea and ran with it. Like I said, Dostoevsky was a precursor to modernism. And so they thought a more fantastical world or a more extreme kind of a world, like the extreme kind of world we see in Diary of a Madman, is actually more reflective of reality than what the realists were doing. And so Borges fits right into that mold like a glove, in that he creates a world seemingly very different from our own, but that teaches us a great deal about our own world. That's a very modernist thing. One of the interesting things this world does is it undermines historical reality. So Borges gives us, at the start of the story, an excerpt from Liddell Hart, who's a real person, book, Liddell Hart's History of World War I, which was a real book. And he describes a real battle that took place on July 29th, 1916. So he grounds the story in historical reality. But then he immediately contradicts that. He gives us a story that did not actually happen, as far as we know. And so why would he... The question here that's interesting is, if he's going to give us a very fictional story in a very fantastical world, why would he then kind of bookend it with these historical details. He's blending, you could say, historical fiction and science fiction here, which is absolutely fascinating to me. I think we have to ask, why does he do that? So we'll try to answer that question as we go when we look at the quotes. And then the central idea here, the main concept, like I said, Borges' stories, I should mention this earlier, they're very tight, they're short. This is only like 6 pages, so it's fairly simple. It's not complex. So he has this kind of tight, compact writing, but he usually has some kind of like science fiction concept in a short story, short, compact story, and then that science fiction concept somehow maps itself onto the real world and teaches us about the real world. That's what Borges does, and I think that's genius. So the concept, the science fiction concept in the story is parallel realities. We'll really unpack that because Stephen Albert has a quote later we'll look at that explains it very thoroughly and I think very clearly. But it's kind of, if you're not into science fiction, it's kind of a concept that might seem very foreign to you. So we need to unpack it. But essentially what it means is, in the simplest sentences, one decision can have multiple outcomes. And I think it leads us to a great question because it's a very science fiction concept. Science fiction nerds like me love this idea of parallel realities, but is it real? I've made a lot of choices in my life. Are there parallel timelines out there where I made a different choice and my life looks very different, and those are the timelines? I think that's not just science fiction. It's worth pondering if it's, reality. I think it's a worthwhile question. Fun episodes of Star Trek aside, it could be a real thing. And then a question of personal loyalty versus military. So an important thing to note is the narrator or the protagonist here is telling a story looking back. It's very much past tense. And as you read in the final paragraph, he's about to be executed. So he's explaining his actions that led up to the moment of him being executed. And he has to choose, personal loyalty versus military. That's the central conflict. He has a personal desire that's in tension with his military obligations. And so we have to ask the question, why does he make the choice that he does? But the thread before this indicates that another outcome would be possible. He could have made a different choice in a different timeline, a different reality. And so that's significant too, that he makes a choice. We have to ask why that choice, but then we also have to ask, what do we make of the fact that the point of the story is that there's more than one option, and maybe both happened. Think about that for a second. Cultural cross currents. So in this story, you have a Chinese man serving the German military, and you have an Irish man serving the British military. And so you have basically two conquered peoples serving the empires that have conquered their countries. And so you have kind of a blending of cultural identities. And this very much reflects the global interconnected nature of the world following the 19th century. And it's integral to understanding the story's message that we're going to get to as we unpack the story. Finally, imperialism. I alluded to that in the previous thread, but he wrote this story and published it in 1941. So 2 years into World War II, as a man who had seen up close the horrors of World War I and other things. So does this story critique imperialism? We have to go back and look at questions 4, but we also have to look at thread 3. Does it critique imperialism? You might want to answer no, because he seems to go to military rather than personal loyalty with his decision, the narrator. But is more than one thing happening at the same time? Let's dive in. Okay, so here's a quote that just quickly, like I said, alludes to the idea of cultural cross currents. He says he's the man pursuing him, the So remember, he's actually working for Germany here. It might be hard to keep track of things. He's actually working for Germany in World War II, World War One. But he's um, he's being pursued by an English agent, but that English agent is not just an Englishman, he's an Irishman. So there's this blending of cultural identities that happens when an empire takes over. So the mixing of cultural identities and empire are at the heart of this story. In the quote, an Irishman at the service of England is a big part of that. So here he's talking about his motives, that personal versus military loyalty early on. Because remember, he's looking back. He's already committed all of the actions that are important to the story. And so he's looking back. And even though this point is something he says early on in the story, he's looking back with that perspective. And so he's talking about his motives here, and he's talking about his personal allegiances versus his military allegiances. And I think through that comparison of those two, a critique of imperialism emerges. He's talking about his choice he makes at the end of the story, even though we as the reader don't know what that is yet. He says, I didn't do it for Germany, no. I care nothing for a barbarous country which imposed upon me the abjection of being a spy. Besides, I know of a man from England, a modest man, who for me is no less great than Goethe. I talked with him for scarcely an hour, but during that hour he was Goethe. I did it because I sensed that the chief somehow feared people of my race, for the innumerable ancestors who merge within me. I wanted to prove to him that a yellow man could save his armies. This is a fascinating passage for so many reasons. There's a lot to unpack here. First, he's basically saying the same thing about himself as he is about Richard Madden, the man pursuing him. He says, I care nothing for a barbarous country which imposed upon me the abjection of being a spy. That's essentially the same thing as an Irish man at the service of England. He could say a Chinese man at the service of Germany there. So, because his country's been conquered, he's basically imposed upon me the abjection of being forced to be a spy, to work for Germany during World War One, to go to England and work as an intelligence operative. And so you have imperialism there, but then he talks about a man from England. A man is a modest man who for me is no less great than Goethe. So why mention Goethe? Well, when we studied Goethe, we noted that he was considered the greatest author to ever come from Germany. He did Faust, which is like the German epic, the most complex work from Germany. And he was this Renaissance man who did so many things. So he's placing his comment here in the context of Germany, since Germany is the country for which he's been forced to work. And so he's saying that this man, who we know once we read the rest of the story is actually Stephen Albert, but we haven't been introduced to Stephen Albert when we get this quote. So Borges is kind of messing with us here. He's challenging us. He's making us be very demanding as readers. What you'll notice about modernist works is they're often very short. This story and Diary of a Madman are both very short. But you probably have to reread more passages here than you say did in Punishment or A Simple Heart, because those are realist texts. They're very straightforward. Here you have to read things and reread them. So because he's looking back at the moment he's about to be executed, he's talking about Stephen Albert, but he hasn't named Stephen Albert yet, because in the narrative he's telling he hasn't met him yet. So, and that's to give us the feeling of being in the Garden of Forking Paths, trying to kind of show us what that feels like. And so why is he comparing Stephen Albert to Goethe? Well, he's setting it in a German context because he's been forced to work for the Germans. And for Germans, there's no one who's a greater thinker or writer than Goethe. So he's basically saying Stephen Albert is the greatest, but he's saying it in a German context. And then so what you have there is the conflict of the personal and the military interests. He's personally very invested in Stephen Albert, but militarily, we know, if we've read the whole story, that he's supposed to kill Stephen Albert. That's the only way he can get a message out to the Germans. And so his military and his personal interests are at conflict here because he loves Stephen Albert as much as Goethe, but he knows he has to kill him. So when he keeps saying I did it or I didn't do it, he's talking about the act of killing Stephen Albert. But we as the reader don't know that yet. We only know that if we've read the whole story and come back to this passage, which I recommend. So we have the military and the personal in conflict, but then we have the reason why he made his decision. He says, I did it because I sensed that the chief somehow feared people of my race, for the innumerable ancestors who merged within me. So he ascribes a bit of racism to the leader of Germany. And what you might have here is kind of a mapping on of World War I on to World War II, because this is taking place in World War I. So it's about 25 years before the time when he wrote it, but he's writing it during World War II. So in ascribing some racism to the chief or the leader of Germany during World War I, he might be kind of alluding to Hitler rather than making the character, the chief here, directly be Hitler. But then he says, I wanted to prove to him that a yellow man could save his armies. So he's actually combining personal and military loyalty. He's doing it to what he does helps the military. He fulfills his military duty. But the reality behind his decision is that he's making a point. He, the yellow man, the homo sacer, the colonized person, he is the one who saves the army here. He prevents the British from doing this attack by revealing the location of their weapons to the Germans. And so it's really a brilliantly plotted, though very short story. And from just, 4 sentences, we get this whole anti-imperialist idea here, which is really fascinating. But this is only one side of the story. This is kind of the realist part of it, the historical fiction part. There's also the science fiction part. So we need to look at that. So kind of bookmark in your head the idea here that there's a real anti-imperialist thrust. And we're going to combine that anti-imperialist thrust with the science fiction aspect. But to understand the science fiction aspect, we have to talk about parallel realities and what they are. So after he goes to Stephen Albert's home and talks with him, we get the explanation from Stephen Albert of what parallel realities are. So try to follow this closely if you're not familiar with the concept. In all fictional works, each time a man is confronted with several alternatives, he chooses one and eliminates the other. In the fiction of Su Pen, your ancestor, he chooses simultaneously all of them. He creates in this way diverse futures, diverse times, which themselves also proliferate and fork. Here, then, is the explanation of the novel's contradictions. Fang, let us say, has a secret. A stranger calls at his door. Fang resolves to kill him. Naturally, there are several possible outcomes. Fang can kill the intruder can kill Fang, they both can escape, they both can die, and so forth. In the work of Su Pen, all possible outcomes occur. Each one is the point of departure for other forkings. Sometimes the paths of this labyrinth converge. For example, you arrive at this house, but in one of the possible paths you are my enemy, and another my friend. So, what does this mean? We all make choices. Our choices, if there's a choice, if there's more than one option, then there's more than one result. This raises the question, what if both results happen? So you take a simple scenario. Here a man called Fang resolves to kill a stranger who comes to his door. There's like at least 4 outcomes that Albert lists. Fang can kill the stranger can kill Fang, they can both die, they can both live. There's probably other outcomes, but there's a minimum of 4. So that could be 4 possible timelines. So let's say Fang kills the stranger at his door. You could call that the prime timeline. But then the other 3 timelines all splinter off of there. They fork off of there like paths in a maze. And they're all happening simultaneously in parallel realities. As humans with a limited capacity to know things, we don't realize that the choices we didn't make occurred in other timelines and are happening parallel to us right now. We just don't know it. That's the theory. Hopefully, it makes sense. It's a very science fiction concept. If you like Star Trek, you'll do really well with this story, which is probably why I like it so much. But when I teach it face to face in my short story class, um, I often mention there's an episode of Star Trek The Next Generation. So if you have 45 minutes and you like Star Trek, or you just want help with this concept, go onto Netflix or CBS All Access, go to Star Trek The Next Generation, go to season 7, find the episode called Parallels, aptly named, and you'll see this. So the character of Worf, who's one of the most popular characters, leaves the ship in a smaller ship called a shuttlecraft for an event. He's gone for a few days. When he comes back from that event, he passes through an anomaly. So when he arrives aboard the ship, he starts shifting realities. All of a sudden, he's no longer the tactical officer on the ship. He's now the second in command, because in a different reality, in a major battle, where in his reality the captain of the ship had lived, in that version of reality the captain of the ship had died. So now, instead of being about fourth in command, he's second in command. He's been promoted after his captain dies. And when they figure this out and they try to resolve his jumping around to different timelines, hundreds of different Starship Enterprises appear, and each one represents a different reality where something else happened. So that image, I should have put it in the PowerPoint, of all the different Starship Enterprises is like the labyrinth here, like the Garden of Forking Paths, where, just like it says, each one is the point of departure for other forkings. There's lots of possible scenarios, and if, like it says here, if they all happen simultaneously and these parallel realities exist around us, we just don't know it, then all of the outcomes are happening, which is a really kind of mind-blowing idea if you think about it. Even if you think it could be real, it's really fascinating. So how does this science fiction idea, we're combining the science with the realism, like I said, how does it connect? Well, the example Stephen Albert gives here of Fang and a stranger parallels what's really happening. The narrator has arrived at Stephen Albert's door. He's there to kill him, which we as the reader don't know until the final paragraph of the story, or the final page of the story. He gives another example. He says, in one of the possible paths, you are my enemy, and another my friend. And remember, it's personal versus military loyalty. This book that explains the theory of parallel realities was written by the narrator's ancestor, and Stephen Albert has inherited it and explained it to him. And so he loves Stephen Albert. He doesn't want to kill him, but he has to complete his mission. And so personal versus military loyalty. So in one timeline, one reality, he could kill Stephen Albert. And another one, he could choose not to. And there you have the science and the realism connect. So what does that teach us? A couple of things. One, the idea of parallel realities is very indicative of modernism. Remember, modernism sees the world as fractured, and so the idea of parallel realities, as outlandish as it might seem to some readers, is a very modernist kind of thing. A modernist writer would probably consider this parallel realities version of the world more realistic than Charles Dickens. Well, Dickens had ghosts. He would consider it more realistic than Flaubert. Well, Flaubert had a parrot as the Holy Spirit. I'm losing you here. Anyway, the most realist of realist writers you can think of, the modernists would consider this parallel forking paths kind of thing more realistic than that. It might even kind of allude to postmodernism, which we'll talk about more later. But postmodernism, rather than trying to build a new society that's cohesive, embraces the fragments and builds a new society that's not cohesive. So this story, a lot of people consider Borges the first postmodernist more than a modernist, so it really reflects both. But what I think is most important comes back to thread number 1, What does the story teach us about the real world? Well, the narrator chooses that military loyalty over personal loyalty. And he's captured. The English agent arrives as soon as he kills Stephen Albert, so he's captured and sent to the gallows, and he's writing this story, telling us to it from the gallows. But two things. One is we've seen he kind of made the military loyalty personal by wanting to show to the German oppressors that a yellow man could save their army. But two, this is only one outcome. What if in another outcome he chose not to kill Stephen Albert and the Germans didn't have the successful attack on the British because they didn't know where to attack, because they didn't have the name Albert? What if, I'm going to add another layer to that, so what he could have chosen that. But if we go back to that quote, for his ancestor, for the person who wrote the fictional book here, The Garden of Forking Paths, not only are two or more outcomes possible, all outcomes happen simultaneously. So while the narrator is waiting to go to the gallows, and a parallel, that word is parallel, means it's running alongside but not overlapping. So while he's waiting to go to the gallows, in a parallel reality, there could be at the same time a narrator who's doing something completely else. I don't know if he would have been captured by Madden or not, but maybe he didn't kill Albert. Maybe he didn't help the Germans. Maybe that's another way of resisting imperialism. So, an anti-imperialist message is a very modern message because the walls of the empires are starting to fall. But the only way it's possible, fully possible here, is if we believe in parallel realities. That's what Borges wants to push us to do, and that's a very modern thing.